Welcome to this tutorial. I recently posted up these goblins on Middle-earth Facebook community page and had some really good feedback, which I was really pleased with, so thank you all very much. A question I kept getting asked was, how did I do the bases? And I said I could do a tutorial if people were interested, and a lot of people said they were. So without further ado, let's crack on. So the first thing I want to show you is how I seal up these holes. Obviously on your Lord of the Rings minis, you'll have a slotter base that goes across there, and the slot that's on the bottom of the miniature doesn't actually fill that entire gap. So you're going to have a little gap there and a little gap there. And I'm going to use these holes here to show you how I would fill those other ones. The principle is exactly the same. So we'll just have a little look. Now what I've got here is PVA, as I say. I've watered it down ever so slightly, but not much. You want it quite thick actually for this task. So what we're going to do is just apply that over there. Now, I don't know if you saw, but the first time I did that, it didn't quite fit. It did that basically, and it left a big gap, which means you didn't have enough PVA glue on there. So if that happens, go back, load up your brush a little bit more, and then we just come in and go across. With Moria, there's masonry everywhere, and I like to make that bit stand out. So to do that, what I do is I use rocks. Now, somebody paid for these and gave me them, but you could obviously just get rocks from your garden. You don't have to pay for them. But I quite like these. They're nice and small. So they're a decent size for this kind of task. And what we're going to do with these is attach them to that base, but we're going to super glue them on. What this will do is it'll add interest, and as I say, it will represent the masonry, the fallen dwarven architecture that you get all around Moria. So just find some suitable pieces. There's another nice one. We'll get another big one. So there we go. Find some nice big pieces and some little ones that you're happy with to represent your masonry. And then we just get a little bit of super glue. I like to actually make sure that they sit flat before I find the flattest side, so I know they will sit nicely on the base. So that's what I've done here, and I'd recommend that you do that too. And then we're just going to put a little bit of super glue on there. Whack that down. Bear in mind that super glue, when it dries, can leave a nasty sort of white residue. So if you've got your miniature on here, make sure you don't add too much super glue. Oh God, it's stuck to my finger. There we go. Yeah, as I was saying, don't add too much super glue, because if you do, you can stain your paintwork, and nobody wants that. That is a nightmare. Okay, there we go. Now, what I'm going to do is let both of those dry, and then we'll come back in a minute. Okay, so we've left that now to dry. And as you can see, the PVA is not entirely dry, but it's very nearly there. And it's good enough for what we need. The next step is to apply PVA across the base. And then we're going to add some of this. It's fine basing grit. What I like about this one, if you have a look inside, is you can see that there's a number of different grades of sand in there. So there's some kind of bigger bits which look really good as scale rocks on your miniature base, and they will go nicely with the fallen masonry just to break up the whole scene. So without further ado, I'm going to put that to the side, and what we're going to do is apply watered down PVA to this base. Now we want this to be more watered down than it was for filling the gaps, quite a bit more, just because it'll help it to flow better. And what we don't want to do is get it on top of our masonry. So if you can, just try and avoid those, just trying to be a bit neat around those bits. This is a very old paintbrush, by the way, if you can't tell. I would not recommend using a good paintbrush to do this task. That would be silly and very costly. So get an old one. Make sure it's all covered. One downside about having thin down PVA is you can see it drawing away from parts of the base there. So just, if you see it doing that, go back, top it up, add a bit more, and we'll be there in a moment. What I like to do actually is sort of sprinkle it over first to get a decent coverage. And if I have to, I will dip it in, but I quite like to sprinkle, to be honest. I think it just feels nice between my fingers. Don't take that out of context. Right, so that's looking all right. So we just tap off the excess and then tidy the rim. Now, we don't want these bits that you can see on the side of the masonry there. Little bits okay, but big bits like this, get rid of. It's actually easier to do this if you have a hobby knife, but I don't have one to hand right now, so my thumbnail will suffice. Just go around and remove that as best you can. And there we go. Now we're going to leave that to dry. And when it's fully dry, we'll come back and we'll paint that up. Right, so we've got that base dry. PVA is all done. And what you'll see is an incredibly dirty palette. And in here, we've got some Mechanica Standard Grey. It's a decent little blob. And what we're going to do is water that down very heavily because we want to stain the sand and we want to cover the rocks just because adding a little bit of paint on there gives a bit of bite so that the successive layers of paint will grip to it better. So that's what we're thinking. So I thought I'd show you how much water I'm adding to this. Basically, we're going to flood it. If I bring my jar around here, we'll do it faster. As you can see, we are really adding a lot of water to this. I like to start out being about 2 parts water to 1 paint, and then we see where we get with that. Still looks a little bit thick to me, to be honest. Add a bit more. A little bit more. As I say in the Battle of Britain, blend your flood the cowling. There we go, that's probably about right. As you can see, that is really, really runny. And as I said, the idea is that we stain the sand. Now, word to the wise, PVA glue will reactivate when it gets wet. So if you put a bit of this down, and then you go back over with your paintbrush and start painting it again, you'll just pull all the sand off. So what you need to do is you get a load on your brush, and then go over once, okay? And just stain it. That's all we're doing. We don't have to worry about paint strokes. You can just dab it on. And then when you get to the rocks, just make sure you cover those as well. So that's all dry now. I want to point something out to you, which is that because I'm an idiot and I decided to try and dry this using a hairdryer in 10 minutes rather than letting the PVA completely set, you'll see these 2 areas here where I filled the gaps, and because that was a big thick globule of PVA, there was no way that was going to dry, and therefore you can see the blemishes. Don't be like me. Let your PVA dry naturally for as long as it takes and you won't have any issues. But because I've tried to rush this for the purposes of doing the video, you can see that it's gone wrong basically. But it's fine, we'll forge ahead, it is what it is. Now, what we're doing now is the masonry. As I say, we want that to be a different colour. The mines, or any cavern, if you're doing it, obviously you're going to have the grey on the base, the sand, that's fine. But you want to break that up. This is a really dull base if you don't. And masonry is going to be a lighter colour, isn't it? So what I've done is I've got some Karak stone from Games Workshop on my palette. And I'm just going to paint the big rocks that we glued down with the Karak stone. You don't have to be massively neat, just, you know, just try and obviously get it on the rocks. And then we also want to do some of the bigger bits of grit that were in the sand. I like to pick them out too. And it just gives you a nice bit of variation. That's a good looking one. And it really breaks up the base actually. And when it comes together at the end, it'll really set it off. So I'm going to finish off painting up those bits and we'll come back after. Welcome back. Here we are back with Decades Old palette. And we've got the base with the Karak stone nice and dry now. Now we're going to do two things to this base now. I promise you we're nearly done. The first is going to add a wash of this over the entire base. That'll just tie it together and it'll give it a lot of depth. And it'll really set off the rocks. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to symbolize some mold, mildew, the kind of dank stuff you would find in a place like Moria. And for that, we're going to heavily thin down some Strachan green. And we're just going to dab that onto the masonry. And when that's done, I promise you there's only one step after that. So hang tight. So I'm just going to get some strong tone. Put that in there. And then what I like to do is use the Strachan green sort of alongside the strong tone. You see what I mean in a minute. So we want to heavily thin that down again, like we did with the Mechanica Standard Grey. We want this to be really thin. We only want to add a little hint. We don't want much at all. What's that looking at? Yeah, that looks okay. Okay. So first things first, let's get that strong tone on the go, and we just wash it over the rocks first. Make sure you get those covered. And then let's just wash it over the rest of the base. Now we're going to come to our Strachan green. And what we're going to do for this is just get little bits and just sort of dab it on, really. I like to do it on the rocks, some on the base, a little bit on the base maybe. Just let it flood in. Spread that bad boy around. Get it to a point where you're happy with, and I'm pretty happy with that. Looks pretty disgusting, but actually when it all dries, it melds together and we'll be left with something very nice. So I'll come back when it's dry. So here we go. That's the base currently. And as I said, there's one step left to do now, and that is to bring it all together with a dry brush of Screaming Skull by Games Workshop. And we want to be very light at first, just build it up nicely, slowly. As you can see, we're working all directions just to make sure that we get a nice coverage. Make sure we get it in, and it'll tie everything together, as I say. So you've got the rocks, the masonry, the different colours on the base, all brought together with a very nice dry brush. And the only thing that's left to do now, because we're not barbarians, is paint our rim. For Moria, I like to do mine black. And if you do that, you will end up with something that looks a little bit like that. There we go. So, happy wargaming, guys. See ya.